All right, good day, ladies and gentlemen. Today we are going to be talking about the historiography of the Great War, how the start of the war was viewed and studied, the way the war began, and the way we look at it. Now, if you haven't yet printed out your handout, I would suggest you do that because there's going to be times where you want to take some notes on this. So, immediately following the war, we see very clearly that Germany is blamed for the war guilt clause that we talked about, that Article 231 of the Treaty of Versailles. And so very clearly from the outset, Germany is blamed for this war. Now, Germany comes out right away, full swinging, trying to counter this claim. They publish this huge 57-volume, high-level politics set of documents and set of narrative to try to discount their blame for the war. Now, the guy who put it together, Bernhard von Bülow, he edited them real carefully. He took some docs out, he put some in. He didn't falsify documents, but he edited them carefully to show that the cause of the war was actually the breakdown of international relations, and to highlight how Germany was scared, that they felt like they were surrounded by hostile enemies, France and Russia, and that British naval and economic dominance made them fearful. And so this is going to have a very big impact. This set of documents is going to have a very big impact on the way people study the war for decades. In fact, the Weimar Republic, which is the government that comes in after the war, they had an official campaign to debunk the war guilt clause. This was one of their primary efforts they were trying to do for political and economic reasons, the reparations, but also just to get over this, try to get the world to not blame them. Now, we see other countries release documents as well, kind of getting their version of the story out there. France releases documents that show that they were not the aggressor at all and that they had been fearful of Germany for a long time. And one of the authors of this document actually called them later essentially political in character. Austria released similar documents saying basically how they were pushed by Germany into this war. Russia releases documents that tried to blame the Tsar totally on the war. Partially because that would help them not have to pay back their pre-war loans to France. And so everybody is trying to paint the war a particular way. Now, the individuals also are trying to get their story out there. Basically, every major politician and general released memoirs of the war so that to try to get their story, to try to show what they were doing was right. David Lloyd George, his famous line, "The nation slithered over the break into the boiling cauldron of war without any trace of apprehension or dismay." Not really taking any blame or credit or anything. He's saying it just kind of happened. Then this story from the Kaiser Wilhelm's memoirs. Basically, it's Russia talking to France. Somebody overheard this, and Russia saying, "We shall have war before the end of August. Nothing will be left of Austria. You, France, will take Alsace-Lorraine. Our armies will meet at Berlin, and Germany will be annihilated." And so this is the way that the Kaiser was trying to say, look, this wasn't my fault. The other people were being aggressive. So, immediately post-war, Germany is to blame for the war, and Germany is trying to counter that blame. Now, it's not until the next decade, 1928, that we see the first big change in this. A guy by the name of Sidney Bradshaw Faye, an American historian. He actually put forth the idea that we still very much use today, that World War I was caused by these big picture causes, that there was a slide to war. Says alliance, militarism, nationalism, imperialism are main causes. He also includes the press as pushing towards war. He never explicitly said social Darwinism, but it's kind of implicit in his arguments. So what he is saying is that it wasn't Germany's fault, that these big picture causes pushed everybody into war. And then again, it becomes this slide to war. The causes idea becomes the prevailing narrative. And It's going to dominate all non-Marxist historiography until the 60s, and even today has not disappeared, as you can tell by the way we learned it. So by 1920, we get the causes, the slide to war. And then this is going to remain largely the narrative all the way through the 1950s. Now, as we get into after World War II and the Cold War, the slide to war remains the predominant narrative for a couple reasons. One, it helped differentiate World War I from World War II. World War II was clearly the Nazis. It was clearly Hitler's war. World War I was caused. It had these reasons for it, not anybody to blame. And that allowed West Germany and its new allies, America, Great Britain, France, to see the Nazis just as this terrible anomaly, as this one-off, this oddity. And it also helped with the goal of integrating Western Germany into NATO, because it was easier to say that Prussian militarism died out with the Nazis, that was a weird thing, that was an anomaly, this Prussian militarism that was part of the Nazis, and that World War I wasn't caused by that. Because if you can say that World War I and World War II were both caused by Germany, yeah, man, that makes Germany look awful bad. And it's tough to be allied with them then. But if World War I had causes and World War II was the German war, well, that's a little different. I think it also shows people are just more comfortable with this inadvertent start concept. Surely nobody would have wanted World War I. And so on a psychological level, besides a historic level, it also works. Now, those first 2 points there about World War II and the Germany and reintegrating Germany shows how historical context is going to influence the way history is written as well. Now, this is all going to change when we get to Fritz Fischer in 1961. He wrote a book that roughly translated into Germany's aims in the First World War. What he does is he has access to new, complete World War I archives. Basically, he gets to the unedited documents, not just that big volume that was put together. And what he comes up with was that World War I was clearly a war of aggression engineered by Germany, that they pushed Austria-Hungary into a local war in the Balkans, and they were using that to launch a grab for world, or more accurately, European power. That they wanted, their goal with this was a German-dominated Mitteleuropa. And this was their plan from the outset. The motives are an important part here, that they wanted this war so that they could have a land and power grab in Europe and even in Africa. No, this is vastly different than anything before. He is saying the war is flat out Germany's fault. This is returning back to right after the war. This is surpassing Shaw's, Sidney, Faye's ideas, and saying those are wrong, that this slide to war is not true. This is very controversial. And so this is where we are now. We're back in 1961, and it's Germany's fault. Now, this isn't going to sit very well with everybody. And we see a lot of opposition to Fischer. And one of the big oppositions to Fischer is this guy Gerhard Ritter, who's a German. Now, he was pro-Nazi, he was anti-democratic, and so that is his inherent bias. But he puts together the argument, using the same documents that Fischer did, that Germany had the same traits as the other countries, and that they shouldn't be singled out. He says Germany bungled into a big war. This wasn't a plan. They weren't trying to start this big European war. He said, look, the whole time they messed up. They underrated the military readiness of France and Russia. They falsely assumed Great Britain's foreign policy was more pacifist than it was. And they overestimated Austria's political and military sense. So they made all these mistakes along the way. How are we to say that this was part of their big plan? Ritter makes the argument that Germany supported an Austria-Hungarian invasion of Serbia, but it was an ad hoc response and not a plan for a continental-wide or a worldwide war. Now, later that decade, a guy named Andres Hillgruber came up with another way, kind of a middle approach between Fischer and Ritter. So Fischer, the guy who said that it was Germany's fault, Ritter saying it wasn't. what he argues is that Germany took a calculated risk. It was a high-risk diplomatic strategy. Basically, this is a lot like the Maracas crisis. This is a lot like the trying to break up the Entente Cordiale. Germany thought that provoking a war in the Balkans would break up the Triple Entente because France and Great Britain wouldn't enter a war for Russia about an issue in a region that wasn't important to them, this way distant Balkans, that it wouldn't matter to them, and that would break up the Triple Entente, which would leave Germany in a better position. But when Russia mobilized, Germany panicked, activated the Schlieffen Plan, and that brought France and Great Britain into the war. Now, so this is Hillgruber's argument. Now, as a reaction to Fischer, Hillgruber says, look, okay, we can no longer count the causes of war. We can no longer say the slide to war is a thing. But he was not ready to say that it was Germany's fault. It was Germany's fault, but it wasn't a premeditated war of aggression. This wasn't a plan for a huge war like Fischer said. So he says the slide to war is out, but it's still Germany's fault, but it wasn't their plan. So again, motive becomes a very important part of this. Now, some other historiographies that came up. Arno Mayer, a Marxist, said that we should understand World War I as a preemptive counter-revolution by the ruling elite to preserve their power. That they felt that the revolution was coming and they launched this war to control the masses, control the proletariat. Very good Marxist history there, very pure Marxist history. Our man, A.J.P. Taylor, a Brit, uses the Schlieffen Plan and uses the timetables for war as a very powerful argument. He says that none of the powers wanted war, but all of them wanted to increase their power compared to the other. And so they made these big, well-known timetables for war, and they were hoping that it would act as a deterrent to war. Instead, what happened is once those timetables were put in place, once one domino started to fall, all of these other things happened, and they had to go to war because the timetables had started, because mobilization had started. And so, once again, bringing up the Schlieffen Plan, which I think you'll see plays a pretty big role moving forward. So again, let's take a look at our timeline here. We've got Germany's fault, Germany trying to counter that. The causes become the vogue explanation. That slide to war remains until Fischer calls it out and says it's Germany's fault. And then everybody's reacting to that sense there. Now, we're jumping ahead to 1999, so we're jumping ahead about 30 years. And our man Terence Zuber is bringing up an interesting take on the Schlieffen Plan Reconsidered. That's the name of his work. And he's looking at previously unavailable and undiscovered documents. So again, I hope you're getting the idea that history isn't static. As we find more documents, as we find more evidence, and as there's more interpretations, that's what this is all about. Now, what he argues, very controversially, is that the Schlieffen Plan, as we know it, the big right hook and then jab, France first, knock them out of the war, come back to Russia, he says it wasn't actually a thing. He says that it was a post-war invention of German officers who wanted to avoid blame for Germany's defeat. I know. So he says there actually was a plan, that they had a plan, but it was different from the Schlieffen Plan that was carried out. And so if the real plan, i.e. the post-war manufactured one, was carried out, Germany would have won the war. And so it's blaming the generals, those early generals in World War I, for not carrying out the plan. And so they put together, he's saying these German officers put together these documents in a way to make it look like it was other German officers' fault. He continues with the argument, and this is the part that blows my mind, that Schlieffen's actual plan wasn't an actual plan for war, but it was an elaborate plan to increase the size of the army. That he was putting this plan before the German politicians who wouldn't give him as much money for the army as he wanted. And he said, this is the only battle plan I can come up with to fight a two-front war. And so, look, I need more money for the military. Wow. Now, he uses different interpretations of the same documents that Ritter used to discount other people's claims. Basically, they both use this 1905 memorandum Ritter says it outlined the Schlieffen Plan. Zuber says it's just a political ploy. And what Zuber says, is that Ritter's bias of a militarized Germany drove him to misinterpret documents. And everybody after him just accepted the view. Nobody looked at the actual documents. And now Zuber's ideas, like I said, are controversial, but they really haven't been disproven. They're still part of the conversation. Now, fast forward a few more years and we get Hamilton and Herwig's book, Decisions for War. And what this does is it completely dismantles the causes, Faye's causes for war, the slide to war. It says they are incomplete. It says, how can we actually measure nationalism and social Darwinism? How can we say those were a cause for war? There are no opinion polls. They actually go into a big detail that at this outset of war, yes, there were some people who were excited, but there was a lot of crying in the streets in Britain and a lot of people terrified. So how can we say those pushed a war? Another one of their interesting arguments, the one I find most compelling, is that they're saying the alliances that we say caused the war were only as binding as the men that made them. They are just pieces of paper. We know that Italy completely discounted their obligations. They were supposed to go to war on the side of Germany. They just decided not to. I think we see the fact that with the Moroccan crisis, Germany thought they could just break up this alliance. They thought it wouldn't last. Other countries weren't sure if the alliances would follow through, if they would step up. This is an argument that Hamilton and Herwig made. In fact, the German Schlieffen Plan, some people argue, Hamilton and Herwig included, that it was based on the premise that Great Britain wouldn't support Belgium, even if they went through it. And so these ideas that the treaties might not have been worth the paper they were written on really kind of takes that away as a cause for war. Now, what Hamilton and Herwig say is that war came about because there was a handful of guys in each country who made the decision to go to war, hence the name of the book. And each of these guys had different information, perception, and motives, but everything was there. Every country had the procedures that specified the war decision through legal operations, and they made those decisions and went to war. And those guys in each country are responsible for the war. Now, if we fast forward to 2013, another decade, we get Christopher Clark's How Europe Went to War, The Sleepwalkers. This was a very popular book. It kind of bridged the gap between academic and pop history. And so this one comes out just on the eve of the centenary of the war. Now, this book's a little different. It's not why the war happened. It's more how it came about. And the thesis Clark basically has, it was a tragedy. It wasn't a crime. That there's no smoking gun. That war was a result, but not an intention. This is a quote from his introduction. The outbreak of war in 1914 is not a drama at the end of which we will discover the culprit standing over the corpse with a smoking pistol. So he's not looking to blame anybody. He wants to say, how does this happen? So one of the points he makes is that Europe just had horrible leaders at the time. That there was not a strong enough, there wasn't a Bismarck around that could take care of things. He also makes an interesting point. The decisions were made by the men during this era of a crisis of masculinity, with the Victorian era and with everybody being worried about demasculization and feminism, that each of these guys in each country needed to prove themselves a manly man, so to speak. He doesn't use that phrase. He also says there's a breakdown in the international order. This old, whenever there's a crisis, call a meeting. You'll notice there was no meetings in July and August of 1914. Those conferences were gone. And so every crisis became a test of will. Every crisis became a chance for war. And he says, again to quote, a decision in one country led to a counter-move in another, and another, quickly narrowing all possible courses of action. And eventually we get that push into war. And he says, to use his words again, the leaders of Europe were sleepwalkers, watchful but unseeing, blind to the reality of the horror they were about to bring into the world. And so he doesn't issue blame. He says that it came about because of these reasons. So now, the big picture here. there's been a lot of changes in the way we viewed the start of the war since the war was first over. That's what historiography is about. It's about studying the time and place, the sources available, the biases, trying to see why the single event interpretation can change so many times, can fluctuate full spectrum back and forth from Germany's fault to not Germany's fault, back and forth. And so the question I want you to answer, and I want you to answer this right at the bottom here, is why is this so changing? Why is the historiography, specifically of the start of World War I, why is it so changing? Why has it changed so many times over the course of the last century? Why is this topic so controversial? So I included a little bibliography here for you if you're interested in taking a look at where I got my sources from or looking them up yourself. Thank you for listening, and I look forward to discussing this with you down the road.